At Harvard University, brilliance is often measured by titles and the names engraved on office doors. Students spend years chasing recognition, while professors dedicate their lives to pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Yet sometimes, the most remarkable minds are found in places where no one thinks to look. For more than 20 years, Evelyn Carter quietly worked as a janitor on Harvard's campus. Most students knew her only as the woman who cleaned lecture halls after class and greeted people with a warm smile in the early mornings. Few knew anything about her life beyond that. So when a renowned Harvard mathematics professor publicly mocked the idea that someone like Evelyn could understand an impossible equation, nobody expected what would happen next. What began as a casual challenge inside a crowded lecture hall would soon uncover a forgotten story of sacrifice, lost opportunities, and a brilliance that had remained hidden in plain sight for decades. Every morning, long before Harvard University came to life, Evelyn Carter was already working. While students slept in dormitories and professors prepared lectures for the day ahead, she moved quietly through nearly empty buildings with a cleaning cart and a ring of keys attached to her belt. By 5:30 in the morning, she would already be making her way through lecture halls, research centers, and administrative offices, ensuring everything was spotless before the first classes began. After more than 2 decades on campus, the routine had become second nature. She knew which classroom lights flickered during rainy weather. She knew which doors refused to close properly in winter. She knew which professors arrived earliest and which students frequently stayed in libraries long after midnight. In many ways, Evelyn knew Harvard better than most of the people who studied and worked there. Yet few people truly knew her. To most students, she was simply Ms. Carter, the friendly janitor who always smiled, the woman who occasionally reminded exhausted undergraduates to get some sleep, the person who somehow seemed to appear whenever a classroom needed cleaning. What students rarely noticed was the book that never left her bag. Every day during lunch breaks, Evelyn sat alone in a quiet corner of the campus courtyard and read. Not novels, not magazines, mathematics, dense academic papers, research journals, complex textbooks filled with equations that many graduate students would struggle to understand. If anyone happened to glance over her shoulder, they usually assumed she was looking at something else. After all, why would a janitor spend her free time reading advanced mathematics? The assumption never bothered Evelyn. She had grown accustomed to being underestimated. Years earlier, it might have frustrated her. Now it simply felt familiar. On this particular Tuesday morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Jefferson Hall as Evelyn pushed her cart into one of Harvard's largest lecture rooms. A major mathematics seminar had been scheduled for later that afternoon, and she wanted to finish cleaning before professors and students arrived. The room was empty except for equations covering nearly every inch of the massive blackboard. Evelyn paused. Her eyes scanned the symbols. Several lines of calculations stretched across the board, interrupted by crossed-out attempts and handwritten notes. Someone had clearly been struggling with a difficult problem. Without thinking, she stepped closer. Years of habit immediately took over. Her gaze followed the logic of the equations. One line, then another. Within seconds, she identified the issue. A small assumption made halfway through the proof. Not a major mistake, just a subtle one. The kind that could easily send an entire solution in the wrong direction. A faint smile appeared on her face. Some things never changed. Mathematics still felt like a language she understood better than almost anything else. Suddenly, voices echoed from the hallway. Evelyn stepped away from the board and resumed her work. Moments later, several graduate students entered the room carrying laptops and notebooks. None of them paid much attention to the janitor cleaning near the front row. They walked past her without a second glance. Evelyn didn't mind. She had spent years becoming invisible. What she didn't know was that the equations on the board belonged to one of Harvard's most celebrated mathematics professors. Nor did she know that before the week ended, those same equations would completely change the way the university saw her. The unfinished proof on the blackboard seemed insignificant at first, but it was about to pull Evelyn into a situation she had spent years avoiding. As students filled the lecture hall later that day, a renowned professor prepared to present a mathematical challenge that many believed was impossible to solve. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, every seat inside Jefferson Hall was occupied. Graduate students lined the aisles. Visiting scholars filled the back rows. A handful of undergraduate mathematics majors stood near the walls, hoping to observe one of Harvard's most respected professors in action. At the center of all that attention stood Professor Richard Langford. For nearly 20 years, Langford had been one of the most recognizable names in Harvard's mathematics department. His research had been published internationally. His lectures regularly attracted audiences far larger than most academic seminars. Several of his former students had gone on to become professors themselves. No one questioned his intelligence. What people occasionally questioned was everything else. Richard Langford possessed a reputation that extended beyond mathematics. He was brilliant, demanding, and notoriously impatient with people he considered unprepared. While many admired his standards, others quietly believed that success had made him arrogant. Students often shared stories about his lectures. Some described them as inspiring. Others described them as terrifying. Most agreed on one thing. Professor Langford did not tolerate mistakes. That afternoon, he stood before the blackboard, reviewing the same collection of equations Evelyn had seen earlier that morning. The room fell silent. Langford adjusted his glasses and turned toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'd like to discuss a problem that has frustrated some exceptionally talented mathematicians. Several students immediately straightened in their seats. Whenever Langford opened a lecture that way, something interesting usually followed. He began writing. Lines of symbols gradually covered the board. Complex expressions branched into even more complicated proofs. Graduate students typed furiously. Some struggled to keep pace with his explanations. For nearly 40 minutes, Langford guided the audience through a maze of mathematical reasoning. Then he stopped. Behind him remained a final equation. Unlike the others, this one stood alone. A challenge, a puzzle, a dead end. Langford folded his arms. This is where things become interesting. The room became even quieter. This equation has resisted multiple attempts at simplification. A few students exchanged glances. Several recognized the problem immediately. It had become something of a departmental obsession during recent weeks. The professor smiled slightly. 3 faculty members have attempted it. He raised a finger. None succeeded. A second finger. 7 doctoral candidates. Another pause. No success. The audience laughed softly. Langford pointed toward the board. At this point, the problem has become more stubborn than difficult. The confidence in his voice generated another wave of laughter. Yet despite the humor, the challenge remained real. Many of the people in that room were among the strongest mathematics students in the country, and none had solved it. Near the back of the lecture hall, several graduate students whispered among themselves. One of them, Daniel Cho, had spent nearly 10 hours working on the equation the previous weekend. Another had attempted it for 3 straight days. Neither had come close. The problem wasn't impossible, at least theoretically, but nobody seemed capable of finding the missing piece. Langford glanced around the room. Perhaps someone here would like to try. The invitation generated nervous smiles. No volunteers appeared. Not surprising. Standing at the board and failing in front of Professor Langford was not an experience many students actively sought. The professor shrugged. That's what I thought. More laughter followed. As the seminar continued, students debated possible approaches. Ideas were proposed and dismissed. New strategies emerged only to collapse under closer examination. Meanwhile, outside the lecture hall, Evelyn continued her normal duties. She cleaned offices, emptied trash bins, prepared classrooms for evening sessions, completely unaware that inside Jefferson Hall, the mathematical challenge was slowly becoming the center of attention across the department. By early evening, the seminar finally ended. Students gathered their belongings while continuing animated discussions about the equation. Many planned to spend the night attempting fresh solutions. Some looked excited. Others looked defeated. Professor Langford remained near the front of the room, speaking with several faculty members. As the audience gradually dispersed, he glanced once more at the blackboard. The equation remained unsolved. For him, that was irritating. For others, it was fascinating. None of them realized that the person closest to the solution had already seen the problem earlier that morning. And she wasn't a professor. She wasn't a doctoral candidate. She wasn't even a student. She was the woman who would soon return to clean the room after everyone else had gone home. While Harvard's brightest minds continued searching for answers, the one person capable of seeing the solution wasn't part of the discussion at all. Later that evening, an unexpected conversation inside an empty lecture hall would set in motion the event that changed everything. By 8 o'clock that evening, most of Jefferson Hall had emptied. The energy and excitement that had filled the lecture room earlier in the day had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of ventilation systems and distant footsteps echoing through nearly empty corridors. A few graduate students still occupied scattered tables, stubbornly working through calculations. But even they were beginning to lose momentum. The equation remained unsolved. For many, that fact had become increasingly frustrating. Daniel Cho sat alone in the third row, staring at pages filled with crossed-out attempts. Over the past 3 hours, he had tried 4 different approaches and abandoned all 4. Each seemed promising at first, only to collapse somewhere in the middle of the proof. He rubbed his eyes. Impossible. The word escaped before he realized he had spoken aloud. From the front of the room, another doctoral student laughed. At this point, I think Langford enjoys watching us suffer. Several exhausted students nodded in agreement. The joke wasn't entirely inaccurate. Professor Langford had a reputation for presenting difficult problems and allowing his students to wrestle with them for days before offering guidance. He believed struggle was part of learning. Most of the time, he was right. Tonight, however, frustration was beginning to outweigh curiosity. Unebewan, students packed their bags and left. Eventually, only Daniel remained. He looked toward the blackboard one final time before sighing and gathering his notes. Tomorrow, he muttered. As he exited the room, the lights remained on. The equation remained on the board. And for the first time all day, the lecture hall became completely silent. Less than 20 minutes later, Evelyn Carter entered pushing her cleaning cart. Like every evening, she followed the same routine. Trash bins, desks, floors, windows, nothing unusual. At least not initially. As she approached the front of the lecture hall, her attention drifted toward the blackboard once more. The equation was still there, covering nearly half the board. She paused, not intentionally. The habit was automatic. Mathematics had always drawn her attention the way music draws the attention of musicians. Before she realized it, she was standing directly in front of the board, studying, analyzing, following the logic. A minute passed, then another. Her eyes moved across the proof. The more she examined it, the more familiar the mistake became. Earlier that morning, she had sensed something wasn't quite right. Now, with fewer distractions, she could see it clearly. The issue wasn't near the end. It was near the beginning. A subtle assumption, perfectly reasonable on the surface, completely misleading underneath. The kind of error capable of sending brilliant people in the wrong direction for days. Evelyn smiled faintly. It reminded her of something an old professor once told her many years ago. The hardest mistakes to find are the ones that look correct. The memory surfaced unexpectedly, along with others. Lecture halls, research discussions, late nights spent solving proofs. Dreams she hadn't thought about in years. For a brief moment, she wasn't a janitor standing in an empty Harvard classroom. She was a young mathematician again. Then the moment passed. Evelyn picked up an eraser. She hesitated. Technically, she shouldn't touch the board. The equations belonged to faculty members. Students occasionally became upset when classroom work disappeared. Still, the temptation was difficult to ignore. After a few seconds, she carefully wrote a single symbol beneath one section of the proof. Nothing more. Just one adjustment. One tiny correction. Then she stepped back. The entire structure suddenly looked cleaner, simpler, more elegant. Evelyn chuckled softly. Even after all these years, mathematics still had a way of feeling beautiful. She quickly erased the addition. No reason to leave it there. No reason to create questions. Returning the eraser to its tray, she resumed cleaning. Within minutes, the lecture hall looked exactly as it had before. No evidence remained. No one would ever know. Or so she thought, because what Evelyn didn't realize was that she wasn't alone. At the far end of the hallway, Professor Richard Langford had returned to retrieve a folder he had accidentally left behind after the seminar. As he approached the lecture room, he caught a glimpse of something through the doorway. A janitor standing at the blackboard, holding chalk. Looking directly at the equation, the sight made him pause. At first, he assumed she was simply cleaning. Then he noticed something else. She wasn't erasing. She was studying it. And for reasons he couldn't explain, the image stayed with him long after he walked away. The next morning, that brief observation would lead to a conversation that neither of them would ever forget. Professor Langford thought he had witnessed something unusual, but he had no idea how significant that moment would soon become. When Langford returned to the lecture hall the following morning, a small detail on the blackboard would challenge everything he thought he knew about the woman cleaning his classroom. The following morning, Professor Richard Langford arrived at Jefferson Hall earlier than usual. The image from the previous evening lingered in his mind more than he cared to admit. It wasn't because he believed a janitor had solved the equation. That idea seemed ridiculous. Rather, he was curious about what exactly Evelyn Carter had been doing at the board. As he entered the lecture hall, the first thing he noticed was that everything looked perfectly normal. The desks were arranged neatly, the floor was spotless. The room was ready for another day of classes. Then his eyes moved toward the blackboard, and he stopped. Something was different. Not dramatically different. Just enough to catch the attention of someone who had spent days studying the same equation. Langford stepped closer. His gaze narrowed. For several moments, he simply stared. Then he picked up a piece of chalk. Near the center of the proof, a small notation had been added and erased. The mark itself was gone, but a faint trace remained beneath the morning light. Most people would never have noticed it. Langford did. The position of the correction wasn't random. In fact, it was located exactly where he had begun, suspecting the problem originated. A strange feeling settled over him. He immediately began working through the equations again. Line by line, assumption by assumption. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Gradually, a possibility emerged. His eyes widened slightly. The correction wasn't a solution, but it pointed toward one. More importantly, it pointed toward the correct place to begin looking. The realization unsettled him, because only someone who genuinely understood the mathematics could have identified that section of the proof. That didn't make sense, at least not according to everything he believed. Later that afternoon, the mathematics department hosted another seminar. Once again, graduate students filled the lecture hall, eager to hear updates regarding the now infamous equation. The challenge had become something of a campus curiosity. Even students from other departments had begun discussing it. As the lecture progressed, Langford revisited several failed approaches before eventually arriving at the section where the mysterious correction had appeared. Then he paused. The interesting thing, he said, turning toward the audience, is that most people are searching for the mistake in the wrong place. Students immediately became attentive. Several began taking notes. Langford continued. The issue isn't near the conclusion. He tapped the board. It's hidden much earlier. Murmurs spread through the room. The observation represented a significant breakthrough. For the first time all week, the problem appeared vulnerable. One graduate student raised a hand. Professor, how did you discover that? The question produced a brief silence. Langford hesitated. He certainly wasn't going to tell them. A janitor had unknowingly pointed him in that direction. Instead, he gave a vague answer. Let's just say I noticed something I hadn't considered before. The explanation satisfied nobody. But no one pressed further. After the seminar ended, Several students remained behind, discussing possible solutions. Among them was Daniel Cho. Whoever figures this out is going to become legendary around here. He joked. Another student laughed. At this point, I'd be impressed if the janitor solved it. The group chuckled. The comment was harmless, a joke, yet it triggered something unexpected. Langford smiled, then shook his head. I assure you, that won't happen. More laughter followed. One student grinned. You sound pretty confident. I am. The professor folded his arms. Some problems require years of specialized training. His tone wasn't cruel, but it carried an unmistakable message. There were people qualified to solve such problems, and people who weren't. The conversation continued for several minutes before everyone finally departed. Unfortunately for Langford, he didn't realize someone had overheard the exchange. Just outside the lecture hall, Evelyn had been replacing a maintenance request form on a nearby bulletin board. She hadn't intended to listen, but she had heard enough. The students laughing, the joke about the janitor, the professor's response. For a brief moment, old emotions resurfaced. Not anger, something closer to disappointment. Because she had heard similar assumptions countless times throughout her life, people often looked at a person's job title and believed they understood their intelligence. Sometimes they never bothered looking deeper. Evelyn simply shook her head and continued down the hallway. The conversation should have ended there. It probably would have, except that later that week, Professor Langford would make a public challenge in front of hundreds of students. A challenge intended to prove a point. Instead, it would become the most embarrassing moment of his academic career. A casual joke about a janitor solving mathematics was about to become far more significant than anyone imagined. As the equation gained attention across campus, Professor Langford unknowingly set the stage for a confrontation that would challenge his assumptions in front of an entire audience. By the end of the week, the equation had become one of the most discussed topics within Harvard's mathematics department. What began as a difficult research problem had evolved into something larger. Graduate students debated it over coffee. Professors exchanged theories in faculty offices. Online academic forums associated with the university contained lengthy discussions about possible approaches. The challenge had developed a reputation of its own, and despite all the attention, nobody had solved it. At least, nobody publicly. Professor Richard Langford wasn't particularly bothered by the situation. Difficult problems often required time. In fact, part of him enjoyed watching the equation, resist solution. It reinforced its reputation and, by extension, the significance of the work surrounding it. On Friday afternoon, the department hosted an open mathematics forum inside one of Harvard's largest lecture halls. Students from multiple disciplines attended. Some came out of genuine academic interest. Others simply wanted to witness the ongoing battle between Harvard's brightest minds and the stubborn equation that refused to cooperate. The room filled quickly. Rows of seats became occupied long before the event officially began. Among the audience sat doctoral candidates, undergraduate students, visiting scholars, and even a handful of professors from other departments. Near the back of the hall, Evelyn Carter quietly pushed her cleaning cart through a side entrance. She wasn't there to attend the forum. Part of her evening cleaning schedule required preparing several rooms in the building before the weekend. Normally, she avoided entering lecture halls during active events. Today, however, the schedule left her little choice. She intended to remain unnoticed. As usual, at the front of the room, Langford reviewed the equation once more. Then he turned toward the audience. Over the past week, he began. This problem has generated more interest than I anticipated. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. He smiled. Unfortunately, interest and solutions are not the same thing. More laughter followed. The atmosphere felt relaxed, comfortable, the kind of environment Langford enjoyed. After discussing several failed approaches, he gestured toward the board. This equation has defeated some exceptionally intelligent people. Several students nodded. That much was certainly true. Then one student raised a hand. Do you think anyone here can solve it today? The question produced immediate interest. People leaned forward. Some smiled. Others looked toward the board. Langford considered the question before answering. Statistically speaking, the audience waited? Probably not. The response generated another wave of laughter. Then a graduate student jokingly called out from the middle rows, "What if someone completely unexpected solved it?" The room reacted positively. Several students began offering humorous suggestions. The economics department, an engineering freshman, someone from philosophy. The jokes continued. Then a voice from near the front shouted, "What about the janitor?" Laughter erupted throughout the lecture hall. Most people viewed the comment as harmless, a ridiculous hypothetical, nothing more. Langford smiled, then replied with the confidence of a man who believed he was stating an obvious fact. "If a janitor solves this equation before my doctoral students do, I'll personally resign from teaching mathematics." The room exploded with laughter. Even some faculty members smiled. The statement was clearly intended as a joke. Yet beneath the humor remained a familiar assumption, an assumption Evelyn had heard throughout her life. The idea that intelligence belonged to certain people, the idea that education, occupation, and worth could be measured by titles. Near the doorway, Evelyn paused. She hadn't intended to pay attention, but those words caught her immediately. For a moment, she looked toward the stage, then toward the equation, and finally back toward the professor. The audience moved on quickly. The conversation shifted toward other topics. The joke was forgotten almost instantly. For everyone except Evelyn, because as she studied the equation one more time, she realized something. Not only could it be solved, it wasn't nearly as difficult as everyone believed. The problem wasn't mathematical complexity. The problem was perspective. And suddenly, after years of remaining invisible, Evelyn found herself considering something she hadn't seriously contemplated in decades. Stepping forward, not to prove anyone wrong, not to embarrass anyone, simply to remind people that intelligence often exists in places they never think to look. What she didn't know was that within the next 24 hours, Harvard University would witness a moment that students would continue talking about for years. A joke that lasted only a few seconds had awakened memories Evelyn thought she left behind long ago. As the audience prepared to leave the lecture hall, one simple decision would place a quiet janitor at the center of Harvard's most unexpected academic moment. The forum ended shortly before 6 o'clock. Students gathered their notebooks and laptops while continuing animated discussions about the equation. Small groups formed throughout the lecture hall, debating possible solutions and exchanging theories. Some seemed energized by the challenge. Others looked exhausted after spending days chasing ideas that led nowhere. At the front of the room, Professor Langford remained surrounded by graduate students, asking questions. The equation was still on the board, still unsolved, still commanding everyone's attention. Meanwhile, Evelyn quietly continued her work near the side entrance. She emptied a trash bin, organized several chairs that had been moved during the event, and prepared to leave. Then she stopped. Her eyes drifted toward the blackboard one final time. The solution felt almost obvious now. Not because the mathematics was easy, because she understood the mistake everyone was making. The equation wasn't meant to be attacked directly. It required stepping backward and re-examining one of the assumptions hidden near the beginning of the proof. Once that assumption changed, the rest of the problem unfolded naturally. For several moments, she considered walking away. That would be easier, more comfortable. After all, she had spent years avoiding attention. Yet another thought surfaced. How many times had she remained silent simply because people expected her to? The memory of Langford's joke returned. If a janitor solves this equation before my doctoral students do, the audience had laughed. Not maliciously, confidently, as though the outcome was impossible. Evelyn wasn't offended, but she couldn't ignore what the joke revealed. Most people in that room had already decided what someone like her was capable of. Without ever asking, without ever knowing, the realization stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, not anger, conviction. At that moment, One of Langford's doctoral students noticed her looking toward the board. Daniel Cho, the same student who had spent nearly a week struggling with the equation. He smiled politely. Pretty intimidating. Isn't it? Evelyn glanced toward him. The equation, Daniel nodded. Nobody can figure it out. Evelyn smiled faintly. I'm not sure that's true. The response caught him off guard. For a second, he thought she was joking. Then he noticed her expression. She wasn't. An awkward silence followed. Daniel laughed nervously. Well, if you know something the rest of us don't, we'd love the help. The comment was intended as humor, but before he could move on, Evelyn asked a simple question. Would Professor Langford be upset if someone suggested another approach? Daniel blinked. You mean one of the students? I mean anyone. The student looked confused. Before he could answer, another voice interrupted. I suppose that depends on the quality of the suggestion. Professor Langford had overheard the conversation. Both Daniel and Evelyn turned. The professor approached slowly. His expression wasn't hostile, mostly curious. Daniel immediately stepped aside. Langford folded his arms. You've been studying the board quite a bit this week. Evelyn remained calm. I enjoy mathematics. The answer surprised him. Do you? Very much. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Langford smiled. Not cruelly, but with the confidence of someone convinced he understood the situation. Well, mathematics is certainly fascinating. The tone felt slightly patronizing. Whether intentional or not, several nearby students began paying attention, sensing an unusual interaction. Langford gestured toward the board. So tell me. His smile widened slightly. Do you think you can solve it? The question immediately attracted more listeners. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. A few students exchanged glances. Evelyn could sense the assumptions forming around her. Some expected embarrassment. Others expected an amusing misunderstanding. Nobody appeared genuinely interested in her answer. For a moment, she considered ending the conversation. Then she looked at the equation again and made a decision. Yes, the room grew noticeably quieter. Several students stopped gathering their belongings. Daniel started. Langford's eyebrows lifted. For the first time all evening, the professor appeared genuinely surprised. You can, Evelyn nodded. I believe so. A murmur spread through the remaining audience. Nobody laughed this time, because whether she was right or wrong, the confidence in her voice didn't sound accidental. It sounded certain. And suddenly, the joke about the janitor wasn't quite as funny anymore. What began as casual curiosity had turned into something far more serious. And everyone in the room could feel it. As students gathered around the blackboard, Evelyn Carter prepared to do something nobody at Harvard expected from the woman who cleaned their classrooms. For several seconds after Evelyn's answer, nobody moved. The remaining students stood frozen in place, unsure whether they had just witnessed a misunderstanding or the beginning of something extraordinary. The lecture hall, which had been steadily emptying only moments earlier, suddenly felt alive again. Professor Langford studied her carefully. Years of teaching had given him a strong sense for confidence. He could usually tell when someone was bluffing. Graduate students did it all the time. They pretended to understand concepts they didn't fully grasp, hoping confidence would carry them through difficult discussions. What unsettled him now was that Evelyn didn't look nervous. She didn't look eager to impress anyone. She simply looked certain. A few more students noticed the unusual gathering near the front of the room and wandered closer. Others stopped in the aisles instead of leaving. Within minutes, word began spreading through the lecture hall. The janitor thinks she can solve the equation. The sentence sounded absurd, yet nobody was laughing anymore. Professor Langford finally broke the silence. You're serious? Evelyn nodded. Yes. The professor glanced toward the board, then back at her. Do you understand what this problem represents, I believe? So, it has occupied faculty members and doctoral researchers for days. I know. The calmness of her response only deepened his curiosity. Several students pulled out their phones, not to record, but to message classmates who had already left the building. Something unusual was happening, and people wanted to see it. Within 10 minutes, the audience had nearly doubled. Students who heard rumors returned to the lecture hall. Others arrived from nearby classrooms after receiving text messages. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Carter, still wearing her maintenance uniform, still standing beside a cleaning cart, yet somehow commanding more attention than anyone else in the room. Langford looked around at the growing crowd before turning back to her. Very well, his tone remained professional. If you'd like to share your approach, the board is yours. The room became completely silent. Evelyn slowly approached the blackboard. Each step seemed to attract more attention. Some students watched with curiosity. Others watched with skepticism. Most simply wanted to understand what was happening. Evelyn picked up a piece of chalk. The familiar sensation instantly awakened memories she hadn't revisited in years. Lecture halls, research seminars, long evenings spent discussing proofs with professors and fellow students. A different life, a different future. For a brief moment, the decades separating her present from her past seemed to disappear. Then she focused on the equation. Without hesitation, she drew a line through one section of the proof. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Several students frowned. One whispered to another. Why would she start there? Evelyn ignored the reactions. She continued writing. Not quickly, not slowly, deliberately. Each line followed naturally from the previous one. Every symbol had a purpose. Every transformation carried a logic that seemed impossible to dispute. At first, the audience remained confused. Then something remarkable happened. People began recognizing the structure. Daniel Cho leaned forward. His eyes widened. Oh! Another graduate student stared at the board. Oh my God. A professor near the back stopped taking notes and simply watched. Because suddenly, everyone realized the same thing. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't improvising. She knew exactly what she was doing. Langford's expression changed as well. The confidence he had carried throughout the evening slowly faded, replaced by something far less familiar. Uncertainty. For the first time since the conversation began, he wasn't evaluating Evelyn. He was following her reasoning, and her reasoning was correct. Painfully correct. The section of the proof everyone had ignored was precisely where the problem originated. The assumption hidden near the beginning had distorted every approach that followed. Fixing that assumption changed everything. Evelyn continued writing. The lecture hall remained silent except for the soft sound of chalk moving across the board. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked away, because they were watching something that made less and less sense according to their expectations. A janitor wasn't supposed to understand advanced mathematics at this level. Yet the evidence was literally appearing on the board in front of them. Line by line, step by step. And the closer Evelyn came to the conclusion, the more one uncomfortable realization spread throughout the room. She wasn't merely solving the equation. She was solving it elegantly. As the final lines of the proof began taking shape, even Professor Langford could no longer deny what was unfolding before his eyes. What happened during the next 2 minutes would leave Harvard students and faculty questioning assumptions they had carried for years. The lecture hall fell into complete silence. More than 100 students and faculty members watched as Evelyn Carter stood at the blackboard with a piece of chalk in her hand. Only minutes earlier, she had been an almost invisible figure pushing a cleaning cart through the building. Now, every eye in the room was fixed on her. Without hesitation, Evelyn crossed out a section near the beginning of the proof. Several graduate students frowned immediately. That wasn't where anyone had been looking. For days, researchers had focused on the final stages of the equation, assuming the mistake must be hidden somewhere near the conclusion. Evelyn had gone directly to the foundation. She began writing. One line, then another. The room remained silent, except for the sound of chalk against the board. As the proof unfolded, expressions throughout the audience began changing. Confusion turned into curiosity. Curiosity became realization. Daniel Cho leaned forward in disbelief. The solution wasn't complicated. That was the shocking part. The equation had trapped everyone because they had accepted a flawed assumption near the beginning. Once that assumption was corrected, the entire structure changed. The answer seemed almost obvious. A professor standing near the back slowly removed his glasses and stared at the board. Another faculty member stopped taking notes altogether. Even Professor Langford found himself following Evelyn's reasoning step by step. Every transition was correct. Every conclusion followed naturally. There were no shortcuts, no lucky guesses, only deep understanding. Within less than 2 minutes, Evelyn reached the final line. Then she placed the chalk down. The proof was complete. For several seconds, nobody reacted. The audience simply stared at the board. The equation that had occupied some of Harvard's brightest minds for nearly a week was solved, not partially, not approximately, completely. A murmur spread across the room. Students immediately began reviewing the solution. Some flipped through pages of notes. Others retraced every step from the beginning. The result never changed. It worked. Every single line worked. Daniel was the first to speak. "That's impossible." Another student shook his head. "No, that's the problem." His eyes remained fixed on the board. "It isn't impossible." The realization swept through the room. They had spent days searching for complexity when the answer required clarity. At the center of the crowd, Professor Langford remained silent. Not because he disagreed with the solution, because he understood it perfectly. And for the first time since this challenge began, he had absolutely no idea what to say. The equation had finally been solved. But a far bigger mystery had just appeared in its place. As students gathered around the blackboard, everyone began asking the same question: who exactly was Evelyn Carter? Within minutes, the lecture hall transformed into a storm of conversations. Students surrounded the blackboard, pointing at sections of the proof and comparing it against their own failed attempts. Some looked amazed. Others looked frustrated. Most appeared unable to process what had just happened. At the center of every discussion stood the same question: who was Evelyn Carter? A graduate student finally approached her. "How long have you been studying mathematics?" The question drew immediate attention. Dozens of people turned toward her answer. Evelyn smiled. "Most of my life." The response only deepened the mystery. Professor Langford stepped forward. For the first time all evening, he wasn't looking at the proof. He was looking at her. "Where did you study?" The room became quiet once more. Evelyn hesitated briefly before answering. "Harvard." A wave of surprise swept through the audience. Several students exchanged confused looks. Langford blinked. "You attended Harvard many years ago." The room seemed to freeze. Suddenly, everything about the evening felt different. People were no longer trying to understand how a janitor solved a difficult equation. They were trying to understand how a Harvard-trained mathematician became a janitor. One student finally voiced the question everyone was thinking. "Were you a graduate student?" Evelyn nodded. "I was a doctoral candidate." Gasps spread through the room. Even several professors appeared stunned. "A doctoral candidate." Not an undergraduate, not a master's student, a PhD researcher. The revelation changed the atmosphere immediately. Students who had viewed her as an outsider suddenly realized she had once walked the same academic path they were pursuing now. Professor Langford remained silent. His mind raced through possibilities. If Evelyn had reached doctoral-level mathematics at Harvard, then her performance tonight wasn't a miracle. It was the result of years of training, years of expertise, years of work. The realization made his earlier joke feel increasingly uncomfortable. A graduate student asked softly, "What happened?" For a moment, Evelyn looked toward the completed proof. Then she answered, "Life happened." The simplicity of the response quieted the room. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Because somehow everyone sensed the story behind those two words would be far more powerful than the equation itself. The audience came to witness a mathematical challenge, but they were about to hear a story that would affect them far more deeply. As the lecture hall settled into silence, Evelyn began describing the choice that changed the course of her entire life. Evelyn stood quietly beside the blackboard as hundreds of eyes remained fixed on her. The equation was no longer the center of attention. When I was 26, she began. I thought I knew exactly what my future would look like. Her voice remained calm, measured. The kind of voice belonging to someone who had made peace with the past long ago. I was working on my doctoral research here at Harvard. Several graduate students listened carefully. The situation felt familiar to them. They understood the sacrifices, the workload, and the years of commitment required to reach that stage. Mathematics was my entire life. A faint smile appeared. I loved every minute of it. Then the smile faded. My mother became seriously ill. The room grew quiet. At first, we believed she would recover. Evelyn paused briefly. She didn't. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The story required no dramatic details. Everyone understood. There wasn't anyone else to take care of her. The sentence landed heavily. My father had already passed away, and my brother was serving overseas. Several students lowered their eyes. Evelyn continued. For a while, I tried balancing both worlds. Research during the day, caregiving at night, doctoral work, hospital visits, deadlines, responsibility. Eventually, the strain became impossible. I had to make a choice. The audience already knew the answer. I left the program. A silence settled over the lecture hall. Not because people were surprised, because they understood what that sacrifice represented. Years of work, years of ambition, years of preparation, gone in a single decision. Not because she lacked ability, because someone she loved needed her. My mother passed away 3 years later. The words were spoken without bitterness, only honesty. By then, the opportunities I'd worked toward were gone. A student near the front shook his head sadly. That's unfair. Evelyn smiled gently. Yes. Then she added something unexpected. But life isn't required to be fair. The statement lingered in the room. All you can control is what you do next. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Evelyn glanced toward the completed proof. I never stopped studying. Several students smiled immediately. Of course she hadn't. The proof on the board made that obvious. I kept reading research papers. A few people laughed softly. I visited libraries whenever I could. The smile on her face widened. And I kept solving problems. Not for recognition. Not for a degree. Not for a career. Simply because she loved mathematics. In that moment, many students realized they were witnessing something even rarer than genius. They were witnessing devotion, a lifelong devotion that had survived disappointment, sacrifice, and 26 years of being overlooked. The more Professor Langford learned about Evelyn's past, the more difficult it became to ignore a painful truth. After the crowd finally dispersed, one question continued, haunting him. How many extraordinary people had he underestimated simply because of the jobs they held? The lecture hall finally began to empty. Nearly an hour later, students lingered in small groups, continuing conversations that had long since moved beyond mathematics. Some discussed the elegance of Evelyn's proof. Others couldn't stop thinking about the story she had shared. A few doctoral students quietly admitted that her sacrifice frightened them because it reminded them how fragile even the most carefully planned futures could be. Professor Richard Langford remained behind. For years, he had left seminars feeling confident, sometimes even satisfied with his own expertise. Tonight felt different. Tonight, he felt humbled. The blackboard still displayed Evelyn's solution. Faculty members had photographed it before leaving, and several students had already requested copies. What fascinated Langford wasn't merely the proof itself. It was the person who had produced it. After the room emptied, he walked slowly toward the board. For several minutes, he studied the equations again. The mathematics remained impressive, elegant, efficient. But now he noticed something else. The solution reflected experience. Not the experience of someone who had spent decades publishing papers or competing for academic recognition. Rather, It reflected the perspective of someone who had spent years thinking deeply without needing applause. The realization was uncomfortable because it forced him to confront an assumption he had carried for much of his career. He had always believed talent naturally rose to the surface. The best students became researchers. The best researchers became professors. The strongest minds eventually received recognition. Evelyn's existence challenged that belief completely. An extraordinary mathematician had been working within walking distance of Harvard's finest scholars for more than 2 decades. And nobody had noticed. Not because she hid her intelligence, because nobody thought to look for it. The following morning, Langford arrived at his office unusually early. Instead of preparing lectures, he opened university archives. At first, he wasn't entirely sure what he was searching for. Then he typed a name, Evelyn Carter. Several records appeared almost immediately. His eyes widened. The first document was a graduate fellowship award. The second was a departmental research distinction. The third was a recommendation letter written by one of Harvard's most respected mathematicians nearly 30 years earlier. Langford opened it. As he read, a strange feeling settled over him. The professor who wrote the letter described Evelyn using words rarely seen in academic evaluations. Exceptional, original, remarkably intuitive, possesses uncommon mathematical insight. Langford leaned back in his chair. The evidence continued. Research contributions, conference presentations, faculty praise. Every document painted the same picture. Before life interrupted her academic career, Evelyn Carter had been considered one of the department's most promising young researchers. He stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. For years, he had walked past her in hallways without a second thought. For years, she had quietly cleaned classrooms where professors discussed theories she already understood. And perhaps most troubling of all, he had publicly joked that a janitor solving his equation was impossible. A slow breath escaped him. The memory now felt less like a joke and more like a lesson. That afternoon, Langford attended a departmental meeting. Normally, discussions focused on grants, publication, and curriculum updates. Today, something else dominated the conversation. Evain. Every professor in the room had heard about the incident. Many had already reviewed the proof. Several had begun asking the same question. What should happen next? Because everyone understood one thing. The university had spent decades overlooking someone extraordinary, and for the first time, Harvard was beginning to realize the magnitude of that mistake. As news of Evelyn's story spread across campus, one surprising proposal began gaining support among Harvard's faculty. What started as a solved equation was about to become something much bigger, an opportunity to finally give Evelyn the recognition she had never asked for. By Monday morning, Evelyn Carter had become one of the most discussed people on Harvard's campus. The story had spread far beyond the mathematics department. Students shared details through social media. Faculty members discussed it between meetings, and alumni who heard about the incident began contacting former professors for confirmation. At first, many assumed the story had been exaggerated. A janitor solves an equation that challenged Harvard researchers. It sounded like the kind of story people invented. Then they saw the proof. Then they learned about Evelyn's academic history. And suddenly, the story became very real. For Evelyn. However, life remained surprisingly unchanged. At 6 o'clock Monday morning, she reported to work exactly as she always had. She cleaned classrooms, prepared lecture halls, checked maintenance requests. If students stared a little longer than usual, she simply smiled and continued working. The attention felt strange, almost uncomfortable. She had spent most of her adult life avoiding recognition. Now recognition seemed to be following her everywhere. Near lunchtime, Professor Langford found her organizing supplies in a storage room beneath Jefferson Hall. For a moment, neither spoke. The professor seemed unusually nervous, something Evelyn had never witnessed before. Finally, he cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. Evelyn looked at him calmly. Langford took a breath. When I made that joke during the seminar, I wasn't trying to insult you personally. He paused. But that's not really the point. The honesty surprised her. I made assumptions. His voice remained steady. I looked at your job and believed I understood your abilities. The professor shook his head. I was wrong. For several seconds, the storage room remained silent. Then Evelyn smiled. A genuine smile. Most people do. The answer wasn't bitter. That somehow made it more powerful. Langford lowered his eyes briefly. I should have known better. Perhaps. Evelyn's response carried no anger. No desire to embarrass him. Only perspective. The professor found himself wondering if that was what impressed him most. Not her intelligence. Her grace. Many people would have enjoyed watching him fail publicly. Evelyn never seemed interested in revenge. Only truth. After a few moments, Langford handed her a folder. Evelyn frowned. What's this? A proposal. She opened it. As she read the first page, confusion appeared on her face. The document contained signatures from faculty members throughout the mathematics department. Professors, researchers, department chairs, nearly all of them. Evelyn looked back at him. What is this? Langford smiled. The department would like to formally recognize your contributions. She stared at him. The professor continued. And we'd like to invite you to speak at next month's academic symposium. For perhaps the first time since solving the equation, Evelyn looked genuinely shocked. A symposium? One of the department's most respected annual events. Researchers traveled from across the country to attend. She slowly lowered the folder. I haven't been part of academia for 26 years. Langford's smile widened. Based on what I saw last Friday, academia hasn't stopped being part of you. The words lingered between them. For a long moment, Evelyn didn't know how to respond. Because deep inside, a feeling she thought had disappeared long ago was beginning to return. Not regret, not sadness. Possibility. The possibility that perhaps some doors never close completely. Perhaps some dreams simply wait longer than expected. For 26 years, Evelyn believed her academic journey had ended. She was about to discover that Harvard had other plans. As preparations began for the upcoming symposium, the university community rallied around a woman who had spent decades working in the background, unaware that her most meaningful chapter was still ahead. The weeks leading up to Harvard's annual academic symposium passed faster than Evelyn expected. At first, she seriously considered declining the invitation. The idea of standing before distinguished professors, researchers, and visiting scholars felt intimidating in a way that solving the equation never had. Mathematics was familiar territory. Public recognition was not. For 26 years, she had lived comfortably outside the spotlight. Now, suddenly, people wanted to hear her story. Students stopped her across campus to introduce themselves. Faculty members greeted her by name. Several doctoral candidates even asked if she would be willing to review their research ideas. Each interaction felt surreal. Not because people were treating her badly before, because they were finally seeing her. One afternoon, while walking across Harvard Yard, Evelyn passed a group of graduate students sitting beneath a tree. One of them noticed her immediately. Ms. Carter, she turned. The student hurried over. I just wanted to thank you. Evelyn smiled politely. For what? The young woman hesitated before answering. For reminding us that success isn't always a straight line. The response caught her off guard. The student continued. Most of us spend so much time worrying about falling behind. She laughed softly. Then you show up and prove life doesn't work on a schedule. As the student returned to her friends, Evelyn remained standing for a moment, reflecting. Because perhaps that was the lesson she had never fully appreciated herself. For years, she viewed her life through the lens of what she lost. The degree she never finished, the research career that never happened, the opportunities that disappeared. But maybe that wasn't the whole story. Maybe her life wasn't defined by an interrupted dream. Maybe it was defined by the choices she made afterward. The realization stayed with her until the evening of the symposium. The auditorium was filled to capacity. Professors occupied the front rows. Researchers from universities across the country filled the center sections. Students crowded wherever seats remained available. Among them sat Professor Richard Langford, watching quietly, waiting. When Evelyn's name was announced, the audience erupted into applause. A long-standing ovation followed. Many people smiled. Some students even cheered. Evelyn stood motionless for a second before walking toward the podium. The applause continued. Not for solving an equation, not for surprising a professor, but for the story she represented. When the room finally settled, Evelyn looked out at the audience. Hundreds of faces looked back. Then she began, "I think many of you expect this to be a story about mathematics." A ripple of laughter moved through the auditorium. She smiled. "It isn't." The audience immediately leaned in. "It's a story about assumptions." The room became quiet. "We make them every day." She paused. "About strangers. About success. About failure." Her gaze moved across the crowd. "And sometimes about ourselves." The words carried a weight that only lived experience could provide. For a long time, I assumed my opportunity had passed. The audience listened carefully. I was wrong. A small smile appeared. Life may interrupt your plans. The room remained silent. It may delay them. Another pause. It may even force you to create entirely new ones. Then she added the sentence, "People would remember long after the evening ended. But your value does not disappear simply because someone stops noticing it." The auditorium erupted into applause. Many people stood, then more. Soon the entire room was on its feet. Professor Langford joined them, clapping harder than anyone, because he understood something now that he hadn't understood weeks earlier. Talent is everywhere. Potential is everywhere. Extraordinary people are everywhere. The challenge isn't finding them. The challenge is looking beyond the labels we assign them. As the applause filled the auditorium, Evelyn Carter smiled. Not because she had finally received recognition, because she had finally found peace with the journey that brought her there. For the first time in many years, the future felt open again, and that was worth far more than any title. Evelyn's story began with an equation, but the lesson she left behind would influence Harvard for years to come. The event ended that evening, but the impact of her words continued spreading through classrooms, offices, and conversations across the university long afterward. Thank you for listening to this story. At first glance, this seemed like a story about a brilliant janitor solving an impossible equation. But beneath the mathematics lies a much deeper message. So often, we evaluate people through visible labels, job titles, degrees, income, status, or appearance. We assume these labels tell us everything worth knowing. Yet life is far more complicated than that. Evelyn Carter reminds us that talent does not disappear when circumstances change. Intelligence does not vanish when opportunities are lost. And human worth cannot be measured by a position listed on a name badge. Her story is also a reminder that success is rarely a straight path. Sometimes people step away from their dreams not because they lack ability, but because life asks something difficult of them. Family responsibilities, personal hardships, unexpected challenges. These realities shape countless lives in ways the outside world never sees. Perhaps most importantly, this story challenges us to reconsider the assumptions we make every day. The next extraordinary person we meet may not look the way we expect. They may not hold the title we associate with success. They may be quietly standing in the background, unnoticed by everyone else. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, remember, never underestimate someone based on where they are today. You rarely know the journey that brought them there, or the potential that still lies ahead.